in general, not absolutely with blind tasting. And I think that's what throws off a lot of people getting into it. This idea that someone can deduce down a wine and it's like, oh, they're going to get it right. You could deduce it very well and describe it very accurately and still be wrong. The nose is very powerful, but we are easy to trick.
Welcome to Modo di Bere, the podcast about local drinks and local sayings. I'm your host, Rose Thomas Bannister. This episode features strong drinks as well as strong language. Today, I'm super delighted to interview Dr. Rachel B. Allison, a wine scientist, educator, and competitive wine tasting champion. Dr. Allison has a Ph.D. in wine flavor chemistry from Cornell University and an undergraduate degree in engineering chemistry from Queen's University. Her paper with Austin Montgomery on hydrogen sulfide formation in canned wines was selected as the best Enology Paper of 2023 by the American Society for Enology and Viticulture. Dr. Allison has been awarded and recognized for her research and communication skills by the American Chemical Society, the Association of African American Vintners, Women of the Vine and Spirits, the COSI Award in Food Science, the National Association of Flavors and Food Ingredient Systems, and many other academic and viticultural institutions and societies. Dr. Allison, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Before I start the interview with this exciting guest, I want to let you know that Modo di Bere is a listener-supported show. So please take a moment to visit patreon.com/mododibere and become a supporter. Dr. Allison and I will be here when you get back. I understand that you also, in addition to these awards that I mentioned, you have some news about a new accolade as of this morning.
I do. So this morning, the Wine Enthusiast Future 40 was announced, and I am very happy, honored, grateful. Oh, I sound like a LinkedIn post to be on that list.
Listen, that is really exciting. I was absolutely jumping up and down when you told me. That's so cool. Congratulations.
It's a really cool group of people. Would have to spend even more time just looking through everybody's bios. I'm really excited to meet everybody on that list. Although I'm happy to say that there's a few people that I do know, and I'm so glad to see them getting their flowers as well, including one of my former lab mates. It's so exciting to see him getting recognition for all his work too.
That's amazing. So this is a wine magazine's list of wine professionals to watch.
Beverage professionals as well. So wine, spirits, there's cocktails in there. Sometimes there's I've seen people who work in wine packaging and sustainability. So really a range of, let's say, future, hopefully thought leaders, tastemakers.
That's amazing. Congratulations. I understand that you grew up in Montreal and Toronto. Did you grow up speaking French?
I did, but kind of uniquely, even in my family. I'm the only French speaker in my family. I went to school in French with children who didn't speak English, so I had to learn to speak French. But my parents don't speak French, and my siblings were too young to start school. So I'm the only person in my family of six, immediate family of six, who speaks any French, which is odd, but you know, it worked, I guess.
So your parents weren't from Montreal originally?
No, my parents came from Jamaica. My parents grew up in Jamaica. They moved to Montreal because my mom went to McGill to do her Ph.D. So they went there for grad school, and then they ended up staying there afterwards.
So you were actually the first person from Canada that I've interviewed for Modo di Bere, which is great because I want to ask you about local language because the only thing I know is a swear word, baptismal or something.
Oh, yeah. Tabernacle is definitely a curse word, and I think it's just, I didn't grow up in the Catholic Church, but I'm assuming it's just so deeply sacrilegious to say something like that outside of its formal religious setting that it is a pretty bad swear word. Because my family didn't speak French, it was never even like a swear word that was on our radar as like something we thought about, because I don't think my parents even thought to tell me not to say it.
So what does that refer to?
I think it's like something related to like the Eucharist, body of Christ, the cup for the wine, maybe.
Oh, right. So a wine
that.
reference. Great.
I think it is maybe a wine reference. Blood of Christ, body of Christ. Having not really engaged too much in Catholic Church. I wasn't totally sure what it was used for, although other than I wasn't supposed to say it.
Yeah. You know what? That's so interesting going back into wine history. Just the fact that red wine kind of looks like blood has had a lot of ritual meanings and in a lot of different cultures and histories. But that's cool. I didn't really think of that as like a wine blasphemy. So I'll have to keep that in my lexicon as actually maybe a somewhat drinking related term. So what was it like moving from Montreal to Toronto in terms of like accent?
I definitely had a Quebec accent as a kid, although I think now for the most part it's gone mainly because I don't speak French too much. I went into French immersion school when I moved to Toronto as a kid, so I think I was with other children speaking French, but they were not native speakers, so it just the fact that I could speak French already was the main thing people focused on, not the accent. The accent or lack thereof was not so noticeable in Canada. Although when I started traveling abroad in my 20s, that's when people would start, particularly in France, when someone might comment on my accent.
How is the Quebec accent sonically different from France French?
It's more nasal sounding, and the words seem narrowed and like drawn out differently. My understanding is that French people see it as kind of like a hillbilly accent, but like, I don't know, it just is what it is. Can understand it. It sounds normal to me.
I'm always happy when people are focused more on communication than accent style, unless it's true appreciation of the diversity of different accents.
I think it's like maybe having a pretty heavy Southern drawl or something.
Yeah.
It's like you can understand. It's just you have to get used to the cadence of language is a little different.
We have lots of wine stuff to talk about. I'm really interested talking to bilingual kids. Different languages are spoken at home. So what language were you interacting and communicating with at home?
I mean, I spoke English with my family, but I thought in French a lot. So I was translating in my head, which is interesting because now I have to go in the other direction because I don't speak French often at all. So I have to translate in my head. If I'm traveling in France, it takes me at least a week to start thinking in French. But as a kid, I thought in French. And so I would get frustrated when I would trying to talk to my parents and I couldn't think of the right words and I would just substitute in French words or I'd switch to French when talking to them and then they would get frustrated because I was obviously not speaking English. So I feel like you end up spending a lot of time in your own head with language like that and there's I don't know, it's just there's some words, some concepts, some things that just they'd exist for me in French that that's just their like natural state in my head versus in English.
So when we were talking earlier, you mentioned not really speaking patois.
My parents grew up speaking pretty formal English as well. They actually spent part of their childhoods in London. Both of them actually at the same time because both my grandfathers went to school in London. So both their families were there at the same time in different parts of London, which is also kind of random. My parents have extremely formal English as well. My parents do speak, they can speak patois, but they never really spoke it around us. And then we all grew up we sound Canadian. Like we sound Canadian. And I didn't even realize I had a Canadian accent until I was in Nevada visiting like a mining site. And one of my friends was like, yeah, you have a super strong Canadian accent.
So that kind of generational immigrant experience was one that your parents had already had with their parents. So,
yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah. My family comes from all over the Caribbean. So my parents grew up in Jamaica, but their families are from Jamaica and Barbados and Guyana and Trinidad. And even before that, people from other places, like my family on my mom's side is from China.
Wow. Okay. All right. So you've got like this amazing multicultural background. Are your grandparents still in London?
No, my grandparents are in Jamaica and in Canada, actually. They came up.
Your family are all scientists. So how did you get from science into wine?
I mean, I definitely linked the two, but I always figured I would be in sciences because that was in my head like a normal, like everybody just did sciences and it never really occurred to me that you could do something different. Yeah, my whole family's just, it's a lot of sciences, a bit of math sprinkled in there. I went into engineering because it seemed like you could learn a lot of good fundamental science there. Also, I guess in just like, I don't know, the way sometimes 17-year-olds are, you're like, this seems hard and I want to do a thing that's hard. I just went after what I thought would be a hard program. But I realized a couple years into the degree that the jobs that were coming out of it didn't look like anything I really wanted to do.
In engineering.
In engineering, yeah. Particularly just the exposure you got in chemical engineering was a lot of like pure oil and gas work, environmental engineering, applications, which like conceptually very interesting. I really enjoyed studying that, but I didn't really want to do it day to day. I'd always been interested in food, in flavor, in seeing how like ingredients come together, how they're transformed. Like to me, that was chemistry. I'd always liked that. I really love baking. I still really love baking. So I Googled food science summer classes to see if I could learn some more about this idea I had that I could be in food sciences. Cornell has a food science summer scholars program where it's aimed at non-food science majors to expose them to that field through like a summer research program. I had about 10 days, I think, to make the deadline to apply. And I threw something together. I wrote about my interest in my application essay. It was just like probably rambled about flavors and stuff I'd thought about related to flavors. And I was matched to a lab that happened to do wine and grape chemistry, which is, again, I wasn't specifically going after wine and grape. I was pursuing it from a flavor standpoint, flavor science. But I think like a lot of people, once you get into wine, it's very hard to fully let go of that. Like it's easy to fall into it. And it was like the first time that I felt like this is how you're supposed to feel when you study things. Like this is how excited I was to do it. For example, the PhD student that I worked with then, he's now a professor at Penn State. His work was a lot in plant pathology. So he was working on treatments for powdery mildew in grapevines. So my job was literally to like make smoothies of rotting grapes and then test them for like residual fungicide. And like, honestly, gross. Like, why was I like, I think about that like gross, but it was so interesting that I was objectively, this is very gross. Like, and I didn't find that as gross as probably much cleaner work that I was doing in other parts of science. So I think I kind of knew from the time that if I was willing to do something that was objectively pretty gross and it was very interesting,
you were like,
I was like,
it.
It's got to be this. Yeah, I think it's got to be this. I went into that lab. He went on to be my PhD supervisor. He was the first person who really encouraged me academically in research, other than like my family. He also had that, I got that sense of someone who was just really excited about research and just wanted to tell you cool things about research. I remember walking into the lab tour and he just started taking things out of one of the research fridges, like, smell this, what do you smell? Like, which is not a thing you usually do in chemistry labs, but in food science, you can kind of do stuff like that. And I was like, this is great. I love it.
That's awesome.
All I want to do is like smell random things.
That's a lot of what we do. In fact, I'll tell my sommelier students at the program where I teach to just go into the grocery store and sniff all the fruit. The other day I was in a store where the peaches were really ripe. It was hitting me like a wave.
No, totally. I was talking to some friends, childhood friends, and they were saying that there's a video of us from one of their birthday parties where maybe about 9 years old. And it's just, a scene of, 9-year-old girls just like running around, yelling, laughing, all these things. And I'm sitting at the dining table with a plate of food, smelling all the foods on my plate.
Oh my God,
yes.
You're a natural.
And I was just like, oh no, it's always been true.
That's beautiful.
I feel like I was always very particular about food, but it was like, I wanted to smell what are these foods? What are they? What am I smelling here?
That's so great. I love that curiosity. That makes complete sense, Dr. Allison, because when we met at an event for the podcast Wine and Hip Hop, you told me that you had been a competitive blind tasting champion, and I was so impressed. Can you explain for our listeners, what is blind tasting?
Blind tasting is when you assess a wine visually, orthonasally, retronasally. You taste it and you have to elucidate its origin, describe its characteristics, and then use deductive reasoning to figure out what the wine is, what the grape varieties are, the blend, set its place of origin, quality level based on, what you know of the winemaking in that region, what winemaking techniques have gone into making this wine, what vintage it might be from. In some cases, in some competitions, what winery it's from, depending on what type of competition you're in. And I will say that obviously very exciting to have, I did all of this when I was at Cornell in the blind, we had a competitive blind tasting team called Cuvée, which was a lot of fun. And I learned so much about wine through that group with the professor Cheryl Stanley, who is our team coach. We did win one competition, but we absolutely did not win all of them. And it's I don't know, a good learning experience to see how things swing in wine tasting. And some days you're on and some days you really are not.
Really, in a way, what got me into wine was someone who could do that, demonstrating both blind tasting and also just some really beautiful poetic tasting notes. And the fact that she could identify the grape, the vintage, the region. I just was immediately like, how did you do that? I must know. I want to do that. That's so cool. I thought it was really amazing the precision with which these flavors could be picked out and described. And it just seemed like magic. But all these years later, I'm like, nope, it was science.
Yeah, I think there's a little overlap for like the science we don't yet understand or can't yet fully capture. We see a lot of that in like that's our job in analytical chemistry to quantitate, to separate and quantitate compounds. So in things like flavor chemistry and aroma chemistry, you're usually dealing with extremely small molecules because particularly with wine, we're dealing with things you smell. If it's you can smell it, it has to be small enough and light enough to go into the air and go into your nose. So very small molecules and usually at very low concentrations. So it is very hard to separate those out from all the other stuff in wine, of which there is a lot, and then count them. We barely have equipment that is sophisticated enough even to count them.
So this is the machine.
The nose is actually quite an effective machine for this in isolation, but we can't reliably smell 1,000 samples in a day. Like we can't do it. So we're not like a consistent machine, but like the nose is usually can be more sensitive to compounds than even our like limits of detection in analytical methodology.
That is so cool. I like to tell people it's not like becoming this magical bloodhound. It's a result of the real trick is the books that you read as much as the wines that you smelled. I guess our noses are pretty astonishing.
Our noses are pretty powerful. It is the combination of let's say the books that you read and the wines that you taste, that you smell, because you have to develop it like a muscle, like in the same way that we're very used to visual, auditory stimuli. Like I can look at like 1,000 different shades of blue and still probably say like, yeah, that's blue. Like I would still recognize that it's blue. That's because I've seen a lot more blue and I've been taught that. We learn colors as kids. I didn't get that with smell. And I didn't get that with taste. So I like when you do blind tasting, you have to teach that to yourself.
I do think of it as language learning.
Yeah. And then the way that like blue is something that I see, but I have words for it. I had to translate between two different senses to communicate it. It's the same thing with smell, and we have to translate it into this is raspberry or this is violet. Violet and raspberry have the same key odorant. It's the context that kind of tells you which one, you decide which one you're smelling.
Tell me more about that.
So a lot of flavors, smells are not just one compound. There's often a key odorant, so one compound that you have to have that compound or it's not going to be recognizable as the thing we think it is. Just on its own, it wouldn't actually be enough to qualify it. So for something like violets, it's beta iodine. And like if you smell that, you'd be like, yeah, it's floral, like kind of like punchy floral. And you'd be like, sure, that could be violets, but you smell violets and they smell different because there's other things happening as well. But the thing is that compound, it's also raspberry.
I was wanting to ask you to translate or define a couple other terms, such as the orthonasal and the retronasal, but maybe it would be easier to just demonstrate. Are you down for a little blind tasting?
I mean, I'm game as long as we could talk through it. That should be fun.
All right. Well, cheers. Thanks for coming. I guess you don't want to taste it yet, though. So take us through the process here of blind tasting.
You do all the steps of typical wine tasting. So you're going to assess it. Usually you start by assessing it visually. You hold the glass at an angle. You take a look at the center. That kind of gives you the truest color. But you also look at the rim of the glass to see if there's any discoloration there, any change in the color, change differences in the, I guess, undertones of the wine.
Can you talk more about that? What kind of rim, when we say
so
rim
like
variation?
Rim variation, you might have like a wide watery rim or a thinner rim. Usually a thinner rim means that there's like more color intensity overall, and that can indicate a younger wine. In general, not absolutely kind of situation with blind tasting, and I think that's what throws off a lot of people getting into it, this idea that someone can deduce down a wine and it's like, oh, they're going to get it right. You could deduce it very well and describe it very accurately and still be wrong. The nose is very powerful, but we are easy to trick.
I think people are sometimes confused by rim. Can you,
Okay,
what exactly
so when you hold
are
the
we
glass,
talking?
let's say you hold the glass at an angle over, you want to hold it over like a white background so that you can kind of assess the color of the wine. The surface of the wine is the main thing you're assessing. The rim is the edge of that surface of wine.
So kind of like around.
So right around here. Yeah. So the edge of that surface. So you can see on this particular wine, I would not say there's a lot of rim variation. Sometimes that where you see there's like it's all a little gets lighter as, the meniscus forms at the edge of the glass. Sometimes that there's a lot more lightness than just a meniscus, and that kind of tells you about the extraction, the opacity of the wine. Like maybe other things have over time. Sometimes solids will fall out of a wine, so you will have like less kind of color intensity.
So it can kind of tell you maybe about which grape you're starting with.
I can tell you about the grape you're starting with and age. In terms of grape you're starting with, you're also looking at the opacity of the wine, of course. The color for most wines is coming from the skin of the grapes. So typically speaking, if it's thin-skinned, there's a maximum amount of color you're realistically going to be extracting from that. Versus if it's a thick-skinned grape, there's going to be just a lot more color that can get into the wine. So you have a greater source of color compounds. So typically if the wine is, let's say, not inky dark, if it's kind of kind of translucent, we're dealing with a thinner skinned grape, not a thicker skinned grape. There are exceptions, but blind tasting it's deductive reasoning. You're making the best guess. So you're usually going to pick the most statistically likely thing.
So if you want to take us through what you're seeing here, what are some of the deductions you're already making just from visuals?
So I'm seeing this as like a garnet color. It's not a lot of rim variation, but it is a little paler. This is a translucent wine, so I would guess it's a thinner skinned grape. There's no sediment and there's no bubbles in this, so I wouldn't guess it's super old.
So you can already knock out.
I would knock out sparkling wines. I would knock out thick skinned grapes. I would put them in a very low likelihood category right now because it's possible to do light extraction on thicker skinned grapes. And I see that sometimes, particularly in cool regions where you may have grown a thicker skinned grape that didn't get as ripe as you wanted. So you made a heavy rosé versus a full red wine, and you might end up with something colored like this.
Do you have a visualization that you use for deductive reasoning?
I mean, often I'll take notes, just because that usually helps me to have stuff written down. I also just like to verbalize a lot of it. And for me, I think I have a somewhat unique experience in that all of my competitive tasting was in a team. So in terms of exams, and for a lot of people who do blind tasting, competitions are like individual exercises, but I always did it as a team exercise. And that was honestly something that I liked a lot.
I'm sure it makes everybody stronger.
To have to communicate. Yes, it makes you have to be a communicator. And our team, like I said, it was run out of the Cornell's hotel school, the hospitality program. And I was the V&E captain, so the viticulture enology captain. And we had a hospitality captain as well, who I actually saw yesterday. We were chatting about wine. She works here in the city in a wine shop. We had people from a lot of different academic backgrounds even then as undergrads, as grad students. And we were also one of the only teams to send undergrads to competitions. So understandably, you can only drink once you're 21. So someone had to be 21 before we could train them in our team.
Oh, wow.
So we had very short runways of how long we could practice together, actually get used to tasting together, and also catch them up on all the knowledge, all the tasting miles they would need to compete with entirely European teams. All the other teams are European schools where people had more access to wine and a lot more experience than us. So we had to be very strategic in the ways that we communicate and in the ways that we train.
So how did you choose the people to be on your team?
So we had a bigger team selection of there's a written test of just general wine knowledge. And then from that, as a captain, myself and Evelyn would choose individual people to assign to different competitions so that they could focus their learning. Honestly, my strategy as a captain and as a captain of a team that went to compete, I chose people that I felt did well when uncomfortable. That was what I look for in my team.
Turn off the air conditioning and see how they did it.
I mean, I guess I pick people who, if you're doing something that's you don't need to be doing or that's uncomfortable, then if you're here and you don't need to be, nobody needs to be here. This is not the specific thing that you do. I don't need to do blind tasting in the hotel school to like get my PhD. Like they're unrelated things, kind of.
It's a big commitment.
It's a big commitment. At the end, like we train as a team, like all of us together. So you're probably tasting wine like 5-6 times a week. We're all full-time students, researchers, and all that stuff. I picked a PhD in chemical engineering. I took one PhD in chemical engineering on my team, David, and human ecology pre-med, Susie, hotel ops, Megan, and food and beverage, Brian. Again, so no one was like, you're going to be a SOM. Like that's a specific thing you're doing. It was like, you're here extra. Like it's a little extra for you, but you're still here and you're still doing it every day. So like, and it's like, especially the like chemical engineers, the pre-med, like you definitely don't need to be here.
I just love this idea that's like, actually something that's a side quest. And the fact that you're there doing something really hard as a side quest, as a plus, as a sign of commitment. I think you just healed my conservatory music minor heart. I wish I'd had an advisor like you to pick me for a team.
Wine can be very snobby, but I guess I'm a scientist. Like I'm a scientist who happens to do wine. And then I got into really loving wine and like loving blind tasting and like really a greater appreciation of what a sommelier does. And it was not to say that the people in our group who were go on the sommelier track were like not good. They were excellent. But like, you don't need me to look further for that. I already, like, it's already there. I'm going to look further because I also feel like I'm a bit of an oddball coming into this. I remember going to my first blind tasting with the other V&E grad students, and it was like that thing where it's like, oh, it's magic. Like, how are they doing this?
Right.
Like, and I'm smelling this wine, and I remember the only notes I wrote for that whole tasting were like, old world, new world, question mark? Like, what are they talking about?
So you picked these people from off the beaten path who didn't have the snobby credentials.
They were in the club, they passed the basic knowledge test that we did. They were showing up to tastings and they all could do it. Like everyone could do it. And I just felt that we competed in Switzerland at a competition held by a big hotel school there. I mean, we don't know a lot about Swiss wine, but I looked in the library system, found every book I could on Swiss wine, ordered them to our library, and I assigned them to people. This is your book now. We got to learn about this. And like we crushed the theory section of that competition because we actually study, we prepare. We're trying to make up for the things that we lack. My teammates, some had amazing palates, just not the tasting confidence of a somm.
Mm-hmm.
But like I would take down every note that he said because he was always spot on. Just his ability to pull it together, not quite there. For theory, I mean, no one can memorize like a pre-med. Nobody can remember obscure things like a pre-med. It's like, oh, we need to know what are the top 5 countries for like Sauvignon Blanc plantings in the world. She knows that. So we get points for stuff like that. And like statistically, where could this be from? She'll know something like that.
So you created like a
ragtag super team. Like we shouldn't be good, but we are.
And you won.
We did win.
You won.
And honestly, like all the teams are so good. Like it does come down to luck at the end of the day. Like all the teams are good, but like you can throw anybody off on the day of like, what did you eat for lunch? Like,
and the ability of people from different parts of the world to actually familiarize themselves with
different wines.
Everything.
Yeah, there was one round where I know that we all guessed wildly different things. And I think the team from Bordeaux guessed an Italian wine. Our team I think we guessed a French wine. And then the UK team I think they guessed a French wine as well, but like from a completely different place. And it was like, see, like we're all smart. Like everyone here has lots of wine knowledge, but like we all as teams decided vastly different things. We didn't even think about Italian wines. Like how do we even get into that one? I've never even had that wine. Like
right.
How could we call that? We've never had it, but they have this palette and knowledge that we don't have. And like it's, makes a whole industry to have all of it together.
Yeah, we need everybody.
Yeah.
I feel personally really strongly that the more something goes towards becoming elitist or snobby, the more mediocre it gets because of like resting on laurels and because of overconfidence, just not really having to do what you guys do. Just be like, we're going to read every single book about this. As always, with any field, the more somebody knows, the less they give off this I know everything because they know
the more you
how much you
realize you don't know. Yeah.
So coming back to this one, we've analyzed the visuals and thought about what we might deduce from that. What about the nose? And can you explain those terms, orthonasal and retronasal?
Orthonasal means things that you smell, let's say, directly up your nose, and retronasal is things that you smell through the back of your nose. So once wine is in your mouth, the wine warms up, the pH of your mouth is different. So, like certain compounds that may not be as volatile might become volatile. Some things get released. There are volatiles, so aroma compounds that are released in the mouth that you can smell through the back of your nose because we know it's a channel. So, you can smell things through the back of your nose as well as through the front of your nose. But the things you smell through the back of your nose may be slightly different than what you're smelling through your nose.
Oh, this is so interesting.
Sometimes you will see things that will appear that you didn't get so much initially, or things that were very faint that are now stronger, and that'll give you maybe a clearer picture of what might be going on.
Well, so let's do the orthonasal tasting.
So on the orthonasal, I guess like up front, I get kind of like a Luxardo, like a maraschino cherry, like the dark cherry, a bit of like plum. But interestingly, it's not a particularly powerfully fruity wine. It has some, I guess, reserve. That's the feeling I get on it. It's a bit reserved. I know like old world, new world stuff, when we talk about that in wine, I honestly feel like a lot of it tends to blend together these days just because like wine is such a global thing and you have winemakers moving all over the world. So
And the climate changing. Could you explain what that typically is supposed to mean?
Old world is typically European wines and new world is anywhere else. When you get into Eastern Europe, also technically old world wines like Georgia, Armenia, and a lot of Eastern Europe does produce wine. Greece, oh my gosh, how could I leave out Greece? I love Greece. I love Greek wine, but a lot of Eastern Europe, further east, do produce wine as well. But I would say they're just not as much of a commercial scale globally.
In the blind tasting, when you say, "Okay, I'm going to decide first, this wine is old world or new world," like
Usually what
is
I'm
that
looking
in the
for
glass?
stylistically, very, very generally, old world wines, or let's say new world wines, tend to be from slightly warmer places, tend to stylistically be a bit more fruit forward. So when I smell a new world wine, usually the first thing I smell is whatever the fruit characteristic is. Again, not an absolute. There are some regions, some terroirs that don't really encourage that kind of precursor, but usually new world wines we think of as being like more fruit forward and old world wines as being less fruit forward, more something else, whether it's earthy or mineral or something else.
So speaking of non-fruit in here, are we getting, like, I don't know, like flowers or?
For me, it's like floral and maybe like light potting soil. I feel like it's not quite not the forest floral amount of dirt, like not the decomp kind of smell, but just very light earth and like dried flower.
What about that compound you were telling me about before that could be expressed as raspberry or could be expressed as violets?
I could see that being in here. Beta ianone.
Beta ianone. A note of beta ianone.
Honestly, tasting sometimes with our grad student group, particularly like the wine chemists, the wine microbiologists, like we do talk about it that way sometimes. We're just like, do you feel like this has like people love to talk about methoxypyrazines, but we're just like, IBMP? Like how parts per billion? Like how much do you think is in here?
I think this brings up a good point. Who you're tasting with really matters. If you're tasting for a competition, if you're tasting with flavor scientists, if you're tasting with food writers,
if you're tasting with a team or not.
Right.
You're trying to reach like a consensus versus we're just talking about it and everyone comes up with their own guess. Coming to a consensus, you do a little bit have to be persuasive.
Right.
I would never say methoxypyrazines if I was tasting at a team because I'm going to sound like an asshole. Like I'm not going to start saying like percentages.
Unless you knew that the whole team was
the whole team
on
was
the chemistry
doing that
wavelength. Yeah.
But like I've never been in a team where we were all that background. So it was like, no, that will come across as kind of obnoxious. So I'm not going to do that.
I do have a few little factoids in the brain pan that I really like that I don't always pull out. Like we were talking about colors and I was like, oh, or like Sangiovese, that's low in acylated anthocyanins. We just have we have our terms. I'm getting more of those kind of floral raspberry notes as I kind of hang out with it a little bit. So what are you deducing from what you're finding on the nose? Or what process are you going through?
Well, I start with thinking about old world. For me, this feels more old world because it's a little more reserved in its fruit quality. I immediately start trying to match old world wines, regions that have grapes that are thin-skinned. And I start to think of what things could it be. And then before I'm like really going to start thinking about the structure. And then when I have the structure, I'll go through that list and cross things out because I want to make sure my list is comprehensive before I start taking things out.
What's interesting about the book learning part is you got to populate that list.
Yeah.
Right? You got to know what's
So you need to
on
know
the
what's
list.
thin-skinned and which parts of the world might I be in. Like, do I feel like this is... I don't feel that this wine is particularly hot or particularly cool. So I'm not at extreme... I don't feel like I'm in an extreme climate. So I've also like narrowed that down. I'm kind of like in a certain band of Europe where I'm thinking about.
This is already going to make me sound old, but my visual is I think of populating the card catalog. What could this be? And then you like kind of throw things out. Like, but you got to put the cards in there in the first place so that you don't miss something as you're figuring out what to choose from. So what thin-skinned old world grapes are running through your mind as you do that process?
I start with Pinot and Gamay from France. I go across... Statistically, you could have Pinot from like Switzerland, for example, but like probably not. They grow it. They do make some wines, but like they export like 1 or 2% of their wines. Chances are that we have this in the glass today pretty low. I would probably go France, Italy. I would start with France and Italy and like think about what it could be grape wise. On the thinner skin side, I mean, Nebbiolo is thin skinned. Barbera Dolcetto. Nerello is thin skinned. Definitely missing some.
What about Sangiovese? Was that a thin skin?
Sangiovese is thin skinned, yes. But then you see my own bias where I already had like been like, I don't feel like this is Sangiovese. So I just like it's crossed it, even though it is formally, I have that on the list. It should be on the list. But I will say I am like notoriously bad at picking out a Sangiovese in a lineup. I feel like, again, there's also some can be lighter, but is not like...
Valpolicella?
Yeah, they can be lighter, but...
If it's like the regular Valpolicella, not the Ripasso.
Yeah, the Amarone.
Visually, I think that color could be something I've seen in a Valpolicella. It's interesting. The jewel tones that we use to describe is kind of fun too.
Like I said, both my parents were geologists, and I used to like... When I was in engineering, I did a couple of internships in mining, so like I actually have seen a lot of gemstones. Like when people said Garnet Ruby, I was like, yeah, of course. But then like, oh wait, people don't just like know what that looks like.
Yeah.
So I would say the acid on this is medium plus. The tannin is pretty light, which does knock some things off of my list. Let's see. Alcohol, medium. Body is medium. It's really not like a heavy bodied wine. I didn't smell or taste much influence of oak. Like I could see it having a very small amount of new oak, but it really doesn't taste like new oak to me. It could have used oak, neutral oak.
So new oak flavors would be like...
Usually it's like quite... You get the toasted wood, like the cedary, baking spices, vanilla bean, vanilla, depending on the type of oak, the American oak, the dill, the vanilla, the coconut. Although really only Spain is going to use American oak. Like if I smell that, I'm already in Spain.
This is where we get into just the nerdy joy that really got me hooked. The multifactorial, you're doing such a multifactorial deductive analysis.
Yes.
So it's what kind of barrel from what forest, how toasted,
how toasted is the barrel,
toasted with
how
steam
old is the barrel,
or toasted with fire, oh, God.
You have to kind of like reverse engineer the wine in your head. Like how much winemaking went into this, how much winemaking went into this to help you determine where it might have been made.
When people have talked to me about the term retronasal breathing or retronasal, I don't know that anybody had broken that down for me. Front of the nose. I'd seen that trick done where you kind of suck some air in over the surface of the wine like this.
Yeah, the slurping that you see Psalms do and stuff.
Oh, that's interesting. That got more of a bruised plum note.
The plum note comes out more for me, and it gets more like tart cherry, black cherry, versus like it was more like dark Luxardo syrupy in the nose for me, like that heavier smell lightened up a bit.
Does it change the perception of tannin when you do the...
I don't think it would change the perception of tannin to like aerate the wine a little bit in the mouth. I feel like the agitation just helps to, like you've added energy to it. So you're increasing, like again, there's a heat in your mouth, but you're also agitating it, which adds energy, which helps volatilize things more. This is only so much energy is to swirl it in the glass. And that does help to...
Yeah, why do we do that? Why do we swirl the glass?
Poetically, we're opening the bouquet. But what that does is to add... You're effectively adding energy to the system. You're adding a bit of energy to the system, and you are volatilizing low levels of usually sulfur compounds, things like hydrogen sulfide, actually. Low levels of hydrogen sulfide are going to mask your ability to smell other things. So when a wine is really closed, sometimes it's that. So you need a little energy to help volatilize that, a little agitation to help volatilize that. Like, this is enough energy typically to do that.
What is volatilization?
Put into a gas state.
Oh.
Flavor compounds they're compounds that are soluble in liquid of the wine, but when you add energy, they will preferentially partition into the gas phase.
So when you're talking about a flavor, are you talking about something that can be both smelled and tasted?
Usually we're talking about something that you're smelling. Tasting things is like something tastes sour or it tastes sweet. We don't taste beta iodine, we smell it. We smell it while we taste other things, and that creates raspberry. Like, raspberry also has tartness and it has sweetness, and there's other things that we smell as well, and all that together creates raspberry. But just putting beta iodine on the tongue wouldn't create that for you if you couldn't smell. Like, beta iodine has no sweetness, it has no tartness, it's not that.
How scared were you of losing your sense of smell with getting COVID?
Oh, very. I did one time, and I was like, it was terrible. I was like, oh, I was like telling all my friends, I was like, pray for me. Like, what am I going to do? Like, I spent all this time getting kind of good at this one thing that I can't do right now.
One who said, you don't understand. It's like I was dead.
Yeah. You know, but you don't really know how much time you spend just like thinking about thinking about different smells, and like, just like, what am I going to do with all this knowledge? I can't use it.
I'm glad you're back.
Yeah.
How long did that last for you?
I was out for about 6 weeks. And just the process of it coming back was like very, very strange, just like having to reacclimate. And even now, I feel like I was blind tasting with some friends. We were chatting about this, and I felt like my sense of smell was like, it's there, but it was like some things were off. Like, there were things that people were saying that I was not getting. I feel like I'm less sensitive to pyrazines, actually.
Can you explain pyrazines?
Pyrazines are like, usually it's like green pepper, green leafy-ish. Green pepper is the main aroma, but things kind of related to that, like cut green kind of smell. They are varietal aromas in some cases, and then they're also more prevalent in less ripe grapes.
Interesting. So they can give you a hint about the winemaking, the wine growing. Well, the wine growing, I should say.
I can tell you about the wine growing,
but also the variety.
The variety.
Yeah.
I can tell you something stylistic about the wine. Like, some wines express that more based on how they're made. So like, they're more stable, I think, under more reductive winemaking. So
what are some of the varieties that would contain pyrazines?
Cabernet, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc. Particularly, I feel like I get a lot of it in Cabernet Franc. I think the Carmenere also, because the Bordeaux varieties. Although not that I've had Malbec that has really pyrazines. I haven't had a lot of single variety Petit Verdot to say, but yeah, the other three.
That's so interesting. For some reason, I never thought about all the pyrazine grapes being found in Bordeaux. It must have been like some kind of evolutionary.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I have no idea. Maybe they share ancestry, although that's completely speculative. I know people study this, and there is definitely a real answer to that. I have no idea.
Are you getting anything else as the compounds are volatilized? Oh, I love understanding that.
Up. Honestly, on the nose, not much more, but I'm trying to see if I can get more on the palate. I wouldn't say it's high alcohol, but it's medium in the way that it's like 2024 medium. 2024 medium could be like 13.5%, right?
When you're talking about the palate and you talk about the structure, what are the aspects of structure?
The acidity, the tannin structure, the body. Well, I guess body is kind of a catch-all that includes the alcohol and the sugar. Sometimes the tannin plays into that as well. It kind of tells you about what has been extracted from the grapes. So a lot of tannin will tell you about both extraction and grape variety. So there are thin-skinned varieties that have a lot of tannin. So like, that's where you combine color and tannin. If you have little color but a lot of tannin, that narrows it down to a couple of grape varieties. If you have a lot of color and very little tannin, also narrows it down.
Right.
If you're medium, then like, you could even be some of those other ones that are made in a weird way. So you have a little bit more work to do. You can adjust acidity in winemaking, but like, in general, I find that like properly like integrated wines, it's hard to tell whether something's been adjusted. So like acidity will tell you about like typically whether the place is it's coming from a cooler region or vintage or a warmer region or vintage. As grapes ripen, as the plant matures, acidity is the source of energy that vines metabolize. So acidity is consumed as sugar accumulates. So sugar goes up, acidity goes down. So in hotter places, you tend to have higher sugar and lower acidity in the grapes. So higher sugar produces higher alcohol wines. And then in cooler places where you don't reach as much maturity, from like full maturity, you might have higher acidity and lower sugar, so lower alcohol wines with more acidity.
So like sometimes I talk to people about like, okay, this year you planted your tomatoes in a sunnier spot and they got riper faster, right? That's interesting. I would have thought of sugar as being the fuel or the energy.
No, sugar is the product.
Oh,
Sugar is the byproduct, right? Like sugar is what it produces in the end.
how is this perceived as far as the difference between acid and tannin? What is it like for you in your mouth?
Acid for me is like the mouth watering sensation. So you just see what the like saliva production is like when you taste when the wine's in your mouth. And then for the tannin, it's the drying feeling on I check like the top of the mouth, the front of the mouth, like the sides of the mouth, the feeling of like over steeped tea. And that's usually my reference point for tannin. I guess I drank a lot of over steeped tea growing up. Extracted, like the idea of extraction, like if you leave the tea in there longer, then it's more extracted. It's the same thing here. If you do a lot of punch downs and pump overs, you are extracting more of those compounds.
So of extracting of
tannin compounds.
I think we should explain the must. What are you extracting from? Like, what are you pumping over?
In at least red winemaking, you are doing a fermentation on the skins of the grapes. So when you have your grapes, you put them in whatever fermentation vessel container that you're going to use. And you might do natural fermentation, you might do an inoculated fermentation, but you start the fermentation, and fermentation will generate CO2, and it will naturally cause all of these solids in that mass of crushed grapes and juice and grapes to all of the solids will sort of push up to the top, and that'll create like a cap over the top. And if you want to extract stuff from the skins, from all of those solids, those need to be mixed up in the liquid. So you might pump some liquid over it, or you might punch down the cap to integrate it. If you were making a cup of tea, you would try to have the tea bag in the water, not just touching and sitting on the top. You want the tea bag submerged in the water. You don't want it like barely touching the water. That would not be an effective way to make tea.
So when you were talking about extraction, you get kind of these two different types of clues, right? The variety and what characteristics it has to start with, and then the winemaking that you choose. So you could have like a high tannin grape, but a low extraction process, or vice versa. That's a lot of factors to kind of pick from.
Yeah, definitely. And again, you can always have these grapes grown in non-traditional places. You can blend, which also throws things off. Or you can blend, again, non-testable wines or like non-traditional wines. Whatever that means these days.
When you're doing these competitions,
it depends
it's not
on
like
the competition.
Any wine possible in the world that can be made, these people can check. There's some agreed upon
curriculum. There's a curriculum of
right
wines. For most exams, there's a curriculum of wines. In competitions, it can be a little more random. Like we had Swiss Syrah in a competition.
Oh, okay.
We couldn't place it anywhere else.
Did you get it?
We did.
You got a Swiss Syrah?
We did.
Like,
we got,
oh my God,
but to
amazing.
be fair, it was
you read the book?
We read the book, and we went to a co-op in Switzerland and like tried a bunch of wines. We were like, it's possible. It could be this. Yeah. And we just couldn't put it anywhere else. We couldn't confidently put it anywhere else. Any other place we tried to place this Syrah, we're like, if it was there, it would be weird. Like no matter where else we put it, it's weird. And again, you're at a competition in Switzerland. It's possible. If anywhere it would be possible, it's here.
So you don't have your team today. I'm putting you on the spot in the middle of the summer by surprise. And of course, the journey, the analysis, we already know a lot of things that are true about this wine. But if you're putting them together in that conclusion moment, like what process are you going through and why is it important and what conclusion would you make?
When the tannin was not significant, like I'd say medium minus kind of tannin level, I knock out Nebbiolo, I knock out Sangiovese, I knock out Nerello, and that's where I start to wonder what it could be, because the tannins don't feel like velvety enough to be Pinot for me, but depends on where the Pinot's from. I don't know. Nothing jumps out to me, although like that black cherry Luxardo feel to me, that like that type of cherry always makes me think of Italian wines. And so I feel like I might be in the north of Italy. I also feel that I might be mixing up Barbera and Dolcetto, and I am trying to remember which one is which. One of them is higher tannin than the other, and I want the other one, and I can't remember which is which.
Dolcetto is going to be higher tannin, redder fruit, and
Redder
Barbera,
fruit.
darker fruit, lower tannin.
Okay. Barbera is on my short list then. So if I had 3 guesses, I guess Barbera, the Valpolicella, and then a Pinot. But
Do you find any herbs in here?
I don't get the herbs on the nose, but maybe a little bit more on the maybe a little bit on the palate,
Yeah.
which could push it more like Grenache oriented.
Oh my God, there's so many things to pick from.
Could be Grenache. Could be a Grenache blend. But it doesn't feel super hot, which
Yeah.
I feel like I would want it to have more alcohol, but also, again, could be. Like, I feel like it should be on the list. I actually would rather put Grenache than Pinot on that list.
Yeah.
I had a Vaqueras the other day that vibed very Pinot. That might make sense. I guess I'm deciding if I think it's French or Italian. Despite getting cherry, I don't get much of like a sense of almond, which I usually get for Italian. I often get some almondy note of some kind. There's no reason that I would get that for all wines, but I also feel like one of my friends is a head somm, and she says like one of her instructors on blind taste was like, if you are not sure you can't put it anywhere, like call it Côte de Rhône.
Fair.
And I kind of feel like that's where I am, where I'm like, I don't feel confident that it's Barbera. It's just, it could be Italian and it could be light, but it feels like it's not the, like, once you like run through your process and you don't land somewhere, you're like, I guess vibes now. Like,
yeah. Do you want to decide, or do you want me to?
I think I'll go Côte de Rhône.
Côte de Rhône. Okay.
I'm going to go Côte de Rhône.
Côte de Rhône. All right, it is from Northern Italy. You were
Oh,
right.
so
You were right.
closer.
You were right.
It has some grippiness that I'm like trying to figure out what that is.
Okay, so let me give you this. Your sense of the region was totally right, and the factor that you got stuck on was your clue. The thing that you were trying to figure out that didn't make sense. The structural factor.
Oh, the tannin versus
That thing that was tripping you up was the sticking point.
The tannin versus the weight of the tannin felt like it should be different to me.
Yeah.
Is it that I'm not perceiving tannin and I should be? Or
But when you, like at the end when you're like, there's this grippiness.
It's like the tannin does accumulate from the palate, but I get all the tannin at the front of the mouth, which I'm not super used to. What is the tannin at the front of the mouth?
What's hard about this for me is there's some really like specific flavor indicators that I will often get with this grape that I'm not getting quite as much. I have to hunt for them, and I didn't find them until like 10 minutes. Like there's a floral characteristic, but it's pretty subtle. There's some kind of sweet mint in the mouth, but we've been talking about 20 minutes before I could find it. I could find a little mushroom in there in the nose, or maybe that potting soil thing that was first jumping out at you, but I didn't get that earthiness for like a while until it had opened up. And I think the fact that you were feeling the dark fruits kind of initially put you in a box that would have kicked you away from this grape.
Oh, interesting.
Right? I don't disagree with that analysis. It is more dark fruits. I find some raspberry, but I would expect to find more like kind of tart cherry pomegranate. Not like
I started to get it on the palate.
Yeah.
But in the glass, it was very dark for me. And like the dark fruit initially made me want to be a little bit in Nebbiolo, but then I was like, from the palate, it's not.
Do you have any guesses as to vintage? I mean, I guess you kind of got to know the grape. Do you have to know the grape to guess the vintage?
It helps. It helps to have an idea.
So like put it
like
together.
from color and stuff, 3 to 5.
Yeah.
I would say 3 to 5. It doesn't feel older than that. From the nose, it doesn't feel older than that.
All right, it is a Nebbiolo.
It is.
Yes. Yeah. But it's a Longue Nebbiolo. It's a 2022. You know, I think the hardest thing about Nebbiolo right now is the amazing advances that people have made. And you would know way more about this than me about how to actually explain it. But from what I understand, the ripeness levels and picking the grapes at the perfect time and managing a high tannin grape, that science has just gone boom. Some of my favorite Barbaresco and Barolo producers have these labs, and they're like really scientific about it. So what's really classically known about Nebbiolo is that it's this tannin monster that needs all of these years to develop, but that has transformed so much. So we're here getting a 2022, Langhe Nebbiolo, the larger region, is going to be different from like a Barolo or a Barbaresco, which are going to have maybe really big, like if I'd given you like a Barolo, I think you would have gotten it,
I think from the extraction on a Barolo, Barbaresco would be like significantly bigger. I can see how it is this, but it's also like you said, everything that like I guess we're classically taught about styles is changing, and that's like part of, I don't know, the fun of doing this.
Learn more about Dr. Allison's work at rachelballison.com. What is a corked wine anyway? At that moment when the waiter pours a taste of wine for you and you're supposed to say whether it's okay, are you intimidated or do you know exactly what to do? Dr. Rachel Allison is going to answer all your questions about wine flaws in part 2 of this interview next week. Thank you so much for listening. Wherever you go and whatever you like to drink, always remember to enjoy your life and to never stop learning. Support us on Patreon. Grab the newsletter at mododibere.com and subscribe to the YouTube channel at Modo di Bere to watch the travel show Modo di Bere TV. Music for the show was composed by Ercilia Prosperi for the band Oh. Purchase their music at the link in the notes.